thank you very much for those wonderful introductions. I find it particularly moving to be introduced by students. Students are why I do what I do. I think that it's wonderful to have students introduce us because you're why we're here. We do what we do because we love our students, and I think that you're doing wonderfully. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and the slideshow. So I am talking today about the way that I teach, and the way that I teach changed quite radically, as I'm sure it did for many of us, when COVID intervened in our lives. And so I talk about staging the text in class before and during COVID, because the way that I teach is based around active learning. So as soon as I was approached with the topic, the pleasures of teaching Shakespeare, I thought, well, for me, that is the pleasures of active learning with Shakespeare. I am delighted to be able to teach in classrooms that have a great deal of flexibility. And so my students often, well, my students are English literature students who often have very little experience with theater. They may have seen a play, but they often have not been in a play, and they tend to forget that we cannot read a play the same way that we read a novel or the same way that we read a poem. And they will often forget that we need to keep in mind the staging of the play, or the fact that characters are moving on and off stage. And if a character doesn't speak for a little while, they'll forget that that character is even there. So having them get up and move around and consider the ways that the actual bodies of the characters are interacting with each other is a really important way of understanding the text itself. Anyone who's ever been in a play knows that, but if you haven't, it can be a revelation. But also, we know that for many students, just getting up and moving around can be an important part of staying attentive in class and of processing the information in particular ways. So there are some really important parts of active learning and what it teaches. It teaches critical thinking skills because students have to make decisions about what they're learning while they're thinking about what to do with the text. It teaches collaborative working skills because they have to work together to make those decisions. It teaches confidence in interpretation and a sense of ownership in the text because they're making those decisions. I'm not making those decisions for them. And so they have a much stronger sense of that sense of the text being theirs. And they develop what I call a comfortable uncertainty, an understanding that it's okay to not have all the answers about a text. Many of my students, I would say most of my students, come up in an American education system that is now very based around standardized testing and meeting benchmarks, and has taken away a great deal of what was even there still when I came up in school in the 1970s and 80s, which now is very based around telling them a specific set of answers, having them learn those answers, and then move on. So they are often given, for example, a Shakespeare play told, learn that this is what that play is about, take a test that this is what that play is about, and then move on to the next text. So if they have any questions while they're reading, they aren't given any room to explore those questions. they often then come away thinking, but I didn't enjoy that. I didn't like it, or I didn't understand it. And so they often think they can't understand Shakespeare. And so one of the pleasures of teaching Shakespeare for me is helping them come to Shakespeare with questions and to learn that coming to Shakespeare with questions is good. So learning to have multivalent meaning, that this play is a living and breathing text that has meaning that can change based on context. If a play is set in a different physical space, its meaning can change. If it's on in a small experimental stage, it won't mean one thing. If it's on the globe outdoor stage, it will mean something else. If it is, in a indoor Jacobean stage, it will mean something else. Simply the staging conditions can change the meaning of a play. That meaning can change in the hands of different readers because it can mean different things to us at different times in our lives. When I was much younger, I was much more interested in the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or in the teenagers because I was one. Now I am far more interested in maybe the mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or in Theseus and Hippolyta, or in the older fairies, in the arguments between Titania and Oberon. So the ways that these plays can change for us as we change, but then also people from different perspectives and different walks of life, the meaning can change for us. And then the meaning can change with a different audience. Just the exact same play done for a different audience, the meaning can change because they will laugh in different places, and they will cry in different places, and they will gasp in different places, and that will change the meaning. And so multivalent meaning is something that my students are often surprised to discover. So active learning can work in many situations. It doesn't have to be just in a room where students can move desks out of the way and get up and stage things. So students can be at various comfort levels. Not all students are comfortable getting up and moving around. It can be large or small class sizes, and it can also be in different kinds of classroom spaces, because active learning is always just about asking students to make decisions about the text. First and foremost, the thing that I've learned playing with active reading over time, I've learned that we have to work on small pieces of text. We can't do everything in a play. It's best for me to find one small piece of text, maybe 50 to 100 lines, that I think is representative of a larger theme. So if I can find something that I want them to understand about a play, or a theme that goes across several plays, I'll try to find that in one moment, and then we'll work on that one moment, because I've made the mistake in the past of trying to do too much in a small class period. So there are really, at first, there were, for me, two kinds of active learning exercises. There was the small group work and then staging exercises. And then COVID interrupted, and we had to pivot to entirely online learning here. And I had to learn to adapt that to some online staging exercises. So the small group work. This was just the simplest version of this is what my favorite exercise is, just to draw a character. This does not require any movement at all. Students can just do this at their desks. It does require that they work with one other person, because that group decision making is very important for them, collaborating and seeing another perspective. They can work in pairs. They can really work in groups up to 4 or more than that, and it starts to fall apart. They can use special resources if you have them. Paper up on the wall that they can draw on, or working on easels with big pads of paper, but they can also just get out paper and draw on it at their desks. And the best example I can think of for this is the epilogue from As You Like It. And they don't need a special text for this. They can just get the Folger digital editions that are free for everybody and just click on that and go to the epilogue from As You Like It. So the epilogue reads, it's Rosalind who comes out at the end, and Rosalind has been, this princess who was exiled. She dressed as a boy to disguise herself and protect herself. But we have to remember this was originally would have been a boy actor in Shakespeare's time. So this is someone who's dressed as a boy to disguise herself. But at the end, she comes out and she's got this very sort of gender confused language because she's transitioning from being the character to being the actor talking directly to the audience, as is often the case in epilogues, and says, "It is not the fashion to see the lady, the epilogue, but it is no more unhandsome than to see the lord, the prologue. If it be true that good wine needs no bush, 'tis true that a good play needs no epilogue. Yet to good wine they do use good bushes, and good plays prove the better by the help of good epilogues. What a case am I then, that am neither a good epilogue nor cannot insinuate with you in the behalf of a good play? I am not furnished like a beggar, therefore to beg will not become me. My way is to conjure you, and I'll begin with the women. I charge you, O women, for the love you bear to men, to like as much of this play as please you. And I charge you, O men, for the love you bear to women, as I perceive by your simpering none of you hates them, that between you and the women the play may please. If I were a woman, I would kiss as many of you as had beards that pleased me, complexions that liked me, and breaths that I defied not. And I am sure as many as have good beards or good faces or sweet breaths will for my kind offer, when I make curtsy, bid me farewell." And then she exits. When I asked my students to work together to draw how they imagined Rosalind costumed while delivering this epilogue, this is what I got. And I asked them to support their drawings with the text. One pair chose very modern gender ambiguous clothes because any girl or boy in their set of friends would wear blue jeans and a t-shirt and could have hair that's sort of shoulder length and cut like that. Another pair aimed for something that's a little more Elizabethan, but we're very specific about how this is an actor transitioning into, or a character transitioning into an actor, and backed it up with exact work from the lines. And this kind of close work is fairly new for my students. So why spend so much time on a specific speech? It helps them learn close reading, and it helps them learn to focus. They have to learn that plays are living texts, as I said, and they have to learn to support what they believe with evidence from the text, and asking them to slow down like that and really, really focus on a single piece of text and then back it up from the lines helps them do that. If I give them large pieces of text, they tend to sort of skate through big issues and not focus on specific lines like that. But really, that little bit of text can occupy them for an entire class period. And here's an example. Look how closely they examine just by giving very specific lines and supporting exactly what is happening in each moment. So the other thing that I was doing before is the staging exercises. And this they love. This is the most fun because they like to get up and move around. They've often been sitting most of the day, and they are very ready to get up and move around by the time they get to my classroom. And their favorite is what we call the stage off. This is they like contests. They like having to compete for things, and this is one where they have to make choices and they have to compete for whose is theoretically the best, but they know that everybody's is just as good in the end. So they can work in two groups, or if the class is fairly small, two small groups can make decisions and then direct the whole class. Two really good examples of this are Just Doing the Murder of Caesar from Julius Caesar, or The Mask from Cymbeline, both of which are fairly small moments. I also find that it works well to have my students draw names for characters, because that keeps them from taking time divvying up characters, because individual people want to play particular roles. So here are two examples of students working in the stage off. One is The Murder of Caesar, and the other is The Mask from Cymbeline. So in both cases, you'll notice desks are moved out of the way. They're moving all around the room. They have to make decisions about imagining the classroom as a stage, and to rethink like where doors would be, where entrances and exits are. They have to make decisions about where people are clustered, and they find that things surprise them, like it's much harder to walk over someone lying on the stage than they think it is, and it takes longer to say lines than they think it's going to. It slows down the text a lot more than they think it's going to, and then sometimes it speeds things up. But it also changes the meaning sometimes for them. They'll come away from just a few moments of this and saying, this line is much more clear to me now. So they get a view from inside the text that they didn't have before. They've actually, instead of having a sort of director's view from the text, which is what we get as readers, they get an actor's view from the text, from speaking the lines of just one character and having to wait for another character to give them their cue. They have to see what it is like to speak a line from a literal physical perspective, and move within the line and wait to speak a line and then move. And they develop multivalent meaning, empathetic meaning, critical thinking, interpretive meaning. They understand conditional meaning, that things can change based on their conditions, and that collaborative work. But then COVID interrupted. And I had to rethink how to do that, because obviously we couldn't be in a classroom moving around with each other if we suddenly were sent off to different places. And here, that happened while we were on our spring break. Everybody left for spring break, and then the school closed. And many of my students couldn't even return to their dormitories to retrieve their belongings for several months. So they didn't have access to their books, which, thank goodness for the Folger digital texts. And so we could only see each other on screens like this. And I had to figure out a way for us to maintain the active learning, which was such a beloved part of this class, one that I love and didn't want to lose, and one that I know my students look forward to when they sign up for the class. So I had to think, how can we keep the staging exercises on screens somehow, and on, collaborative learning somehow through technology? And so I developed the online staging exercise. So this became adapted active learning. What could we do that when we were scared and stressed and most in need of that community and joy that we get from the staging exercises? And I developed something that allowed students to still create alternative preparations of different scenes and then discuss them in our moments together in class when we met virtually. So I developed a written staging challenge and presented it to a few students at a time who would then create things out of whatever they had to hand. I told them if they were at home, they could use family members, they could use whatever items they had available and take photographs, up to 3 photographs, and then provide them to the class, and then we would discuss them. And so they each had the same set of text. They were given certain things that I asked them to sort of demonstrate, and then they would present them and we would discuss them. I also told them to choose a specific stage. I wanted them to have a specific kind of stage in mind, and it could be an original stage like the Globe or the Blackfriars, but it could also be a modern stage if that is what they preferred. So this is the staging challenge for Cymbeline that I gave them, and it's the end. And these are the kinds of things that they produced. One of them produced the end of Cymbeline using tangerines. And then another one used just Photoshopped. So she took multiple photographs of herself and her brother and her dog and Photoshopped them together to try to approximate how all of the characters would be on stage. And then we got together and we talked in class, but we also took notes while we were talking on a Google Doc in different colors to keep track of who was writing what. And here are some of the comments that show the way that people are thinking. They're noticing things like which characters are put down stage, how the tone comes through, the way that one form of staging really privileged the idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. Another one, the one that had the Photoshopped with the brother and the dog, showed every single character who would have been on stage and really showed how crowded it would have been. And that was really remarkable for many, many people in the class took note of that. And then I will probably stop there because I have a few more. I wasn't sure how much I would get through, but there were other exercises that I did. Just I'll show, this is some more of the active learning that I've done. But I would say the number one thing that I take away from the lessons from active learning is my students saying, it taught me that it's okay to be unsure. It taught me to see the answer in both sides, and it taught me to see complicated character perspectives. And here's another one from Macbeth, using multiple options of staging. And then my students choose which staging they prefer. And what I took away from all of this is that it's okay to be unsure. So my thanks to Professor Knur for inviting me, to all of you for having me. This has been such a pleasure for me. This has been just delightful, and I appreciate more than I can say being asked.
Thank you so much for having me here. Before I begin, let me thank Professor Bates for that succinct lecture. And I'm sure I would also try to, take away something from your lecture and put it in my class teaching. So thank you for that beautiful, lecture. Uh, just a second, I'm just trying to fix my screen and then I begin. Okay. So, am I audible? I think I should be audible. Okay. Uh, so, good evening, everyone. Let me take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to the principal, faculty members, students, and staff members of Sheshadripuram Evening Degree College for organizing this wonderful event. I'm especially thankful to the head of the department, English, Dr. Kanur, for his efforts to make it possible. Before I begin, I would like to express my solidarity with everyone in Bangalore who has been affected by heavy rains and floods, and I hope that things are better soon. Now, while it's a privilege for me to share the dais with Professor Bates, an eminent scholar in Shakespeare studies, it's also a little intimidating at the same time. So let me gather my wits and share my thoughts with you. As you can see from the title of my talk, which the student has, just announced. So if you see, I've merely added an adjective to the title of the webinar series, which is the pleasure of teaching Shakespeare. And this adjective has made all the difference in my research over a decade. I'm fortunate that I have been able to marry my research with my teaching. Keeping that in mind, I have taken the liberty to speak not on the foreign Shakespeare, but Desi Shakespeare. Before I venture into Desi Shakespeare, following the Indian theatrical tradition, let me invoke the bard for his blessings, lest my act ends like a Shakespearean tragedy. Shakespeare was born far away from this land and in an era that is not even remotely connected with us. Despite that, here I am discussing the impact he has had on literature and theatre, not only in his own country, but also in faraway lands like India and Timbuktu, centuries after his death. One may be tempted to ask, what's Shakespeare doing in Bangalore or Delhi, or for that matter, anywhere in India? And my simple answer would be, I'm speaking about him, for he still speaks to me. Of course, there is a history of colonialism that has impacted this transaction, but that is beyond the scope of this talk. Perhaps you could invite me for another talk, on that. An eminent 20th century Shakespeare scholar and Polish communist defector Jan Kott had once reminded us that Shakespeare was our contemporary. Isn't it surprising to see that the popularity of a school dropout far exceeds that of his Oxbridge contemporaries who had once called him an upstart crow? To me, his greatness lies in the fact that he's loved by his friends and foes alike. Take, for instance, the Germans, the British rivals during the period of war, who refused to accept Shakespeare as a British playwright and appropriated him as a classical German dramatist instead. That notorious warmonger and anti Semitic named Hitler was particularly inspired by Shakespeare's characterization of Jews, proving Jean Cott's claim right that every historical period found in Shakespeare what it was actually looking for. In fact, so influenced was the Weimar zeitgeist by the Bard that throughout the 1930s, the Hitler Youth organized Shakespeare Weeks in Germany. I'm sure that the Führer would have offered him German citizenship were he alive, as he once probably did to the Indian hockey legend Dhyan Chand. Even a country that once described Britain as its most dear enemy, and whose high headed author Parisian named Voltaire had called Shakespeare a drunken savage and his plays grotesque, could not resist his talent and welcomed his plays with open arms. It took less than a century for the French public opinion to transform the bard from being a savage to one of the greatest geniuses of all time. Now, well, time to move on from this bardolatry to the topic that I have chosen to speak on, which is the pleasure of teaching Desi Shakespeare. However, before I proceed, let me share my contention about Indian theatre, for it is here that I locate my Shakespeare. Modern Indian theatre has been marked by influences that are eclectic right from the days of its inception: Western, classical, folk, traditional, urban Indian, and so on. And one such influence has been Shakespeare. And Let me take this as an entry point into my discussion of Shakespeare's King Lear, adapted as Sufed Khoon, that is the unfilial blood, by Aga Harsha Kashmiri in the year 1904. Born in 1879, Aga Harsha Kashmiri went on to become one of the most prominent playwrights, poets, screenplay and songwriters in India. Like Shakespeare, Harsha was also a school dropout who picked up the most relevant lessons from real life. He was barely 16 uh, when he had started composing verse in Urdu and Persian, and even added Harsha as his nom de plume. By the next 2 years, Harsha had already composed his first Urdu play, Aftab-e Mohabbat, The Sunshine of Love, within a week, and it is believed that he could sell close to 1,000 copies, in no time. He was not even 20 when he moved to Bombay with a hope to become a munshi or a playwright in a Parsi theatre company that by the late 19th century had already established itself as the most popular form of theatre across India. His first employment was with Alfred Natak Mandali, for which he composed Muri Deshak in the year 1899 in Urdu, and that was based on Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. He went on to write close to 30 plays covering a vast area of themes and subjects, including socials and mythologicals. However, for the purposes of this talk, I would restrict myself to his Urdu adaptations of Shakespeare, and particularly one, which is Sufed Khoon, the Unfilial Blood. Written primarily during his early career between 1898 to 1908, these freewheeling adaptations included Muri Deshak, which is The Winter's Tale, Dil Farosh, The Merchant of Venice, Shahid e Naz urf Dame Husn urf Achuta Daman, that is Measure for Measure, Said e Havas Richard III, Sufed Khoon King Lear, Khwab e Hasti Macbeth, Khubsurat Bala, again Macbeth, Bazme Fani, Romeo and Juliet. Interestingly, his Shakespeare adaptations earned him the title Shakespeare-e-Hind, that is, Shakespeare of India. It must be clear by now that Shakespeare had a significant influence, on the emerging modern Indian theatre. However, the popular Parsi theatre adapted and appropriated Shakespeare on its own terms. Harsha's Safed Khoon is a good example of this process of assimilating Shakespeare in the collective Indian memory. In adapting Shakespeare, the first change that Harsha introduces is to Indianize the characters in the play. Following the convention of Parsi theatre of those times, Sufed Khoon has two mutually exclusive sets of characters. On the one hand are the main characters, which are Hakan, who is King Lear, Arsalan, Earl of Kent, Saadan, Earl of Gloucester, Byram is Edmund, Pervez is Edgar, Mahpara is Goneril, Dilara Regan, and Zara Cordelia. On the other hand, there are comic characters who do not exist in Shakespeare's original but are Hush's own imagination. And these are Guldam, Gulkhero, Turram, Jalil, Baglol, Fadak, Kadak, and Laila. While Sufed does not have a fool, an important dramatic function of the fool, which is comic relief, is provided by these characters in what were popularly called the comic scenes. The second important change that Harsha introduced was to reduce the Shakespearean five-act structure to a three-act one. Now, there are various reasons, but for the paucity of time, I'll skip that. In fact, Harsha stuck to this three-act structure for his other plays like Asir Hirs, which is The Slave of Greed, and Saide Havas, Prey to Desire, which is Richard III. Another structural change that Harsha made to King Lear was with the opening scene of the play. While King Lear opens in front of the king's palace with Kent and Gloucester introducing the spectators to the impending division of Lear's kingdom, Sufed Khoon, following the conventions of classical and traditional Indian theatres, begins with a hamd, an invocation to the gods. And here is the share, a couplet in verse, from a much larger or from much longer sort of invocation, which is accompanied by a song and a dance performance. For the paucity of time, I'll not be able to translate these, Uh, but in case someone needs the translations, I can send it later. So the first share, from the invocation is, and believe me, this is Shakespeare. फसले गुलाई खिली कलियां दिले नाशाद की, हो गई दूनी बहार गुलशने ईजाद की, गा रही है मिल के परियां नगमा हाय तहनीयत, काफ से आवाज आती है मुबारकबाद की. It is followed by a doha, a Hindi couplet, then a chorus, and a song praising the Lord and celebrating the spring season. Parsi theatre also made extensive use of poetry and poetic language, and the Urdu productions, later on Hindi ones too, employed considerable poetry as it gave an opportunity for declamation and a blood and thunder style of speech, which was much appreciated by the audience. As for Shakespeare adaptations in Urdu, Javed Malik, a theatre scholar, notes that the Elizabethan blank verse was transformed into shares and ghazals, or into rhythmic, ornate, and stylized prose known as Nasr Mukhaffa and Musajja, that is, rhythmical and rhyming prose. Since Harsha was an accomplished poet himself, it only helped him become an incomparable playwright of Parsi theatre. An example of Harsha's poetic imagination can be gauged by comparing Lear's opening speech with Hakan's, which is, Hakan is the Indian king, the parallel of Lear. And this is how Lear, begins his opening speech. And even if you don't understand the words because it's Urdu, uh, let me tell you, there is actually no difference. There's not much of difference in the intent or the import uh, of the Urdu speech as well. So it's not very different from what Shakespeare has written for Lear. But I would still like to iterate it for you. And this is Kaka, which is Lear in Urdu. He says, "ए बाई से हयाते जहां बानी, ए रूह रवानी सुल्तानी, बरसों सैरे जहानी फानी देखी, हर चीज यहाँ की आनी जानी देखी, जो आके न जाए वो बुढ़ापा देखा, जो जाके न आए वो जवानी देखी, अंदेशाए मर वो खौफ फरसुरदान घेरा है, थोड़े ही अरसे में मेरी शाम में जिंदगी का सवेरा है, लिहाजा चाहता हूं कि वफात से पहले हयात का एक बड़ा फर्ज है वो चुकाया जाए, यानी ना इत्तफाकी के हाथों से बचाकर ये ताज किसी हकदार के सर चढ़ाया जाए. सबसे पहले मेरे ज़ईफ़ कान ये सुनना चाहते हैं कि तुम में से हर एक बेटी मुझे किस कदर प्यार करती है. माहपारा, तुम औलादे अकबर हो, अव्वल तुम ही से सुने कि तुम्हारी सादतमंदी क्या इजहार करती है. At the risk of sounding like an Urdu apologist, I must confess that the Urdu translation sounds so much better on my Indian ear. Cultural conditioning. But jokes apart, Harsha does not make any change in the intent of the original speech. It remains close to Lear's, with Hakan expressing his desire to divide his kingdom by running a love test on his daughters. He asks the oldest one, Mahpara, who's Gondril, to be the first to express her love for the Badshah, who gives a very Gondril like response. And this is Mahpara, or Gondril. जहां बना, अगर ये अम्र सच है कि समंदर का पानी खूजे में नहीं समा सकता, तो इसे भी सच जानिए कि आपकी लाइंतहा मोहब्बत का इजहार जबान और कलाम के जरिए नहीं हो सकता. मेरी गोयाई इससे ज्यादा और कुछ नहीं कह सकती कि जितनी मोहब्बत इस खादिमा को आपसे है, इतनी कोई बेटी अपने बाप से न रखती थी और न रखती है. Even the younger daughter of Hakan, Dalara, that's Regan, echoes the sentiments of Regan and declares her love for Hakan in the superlatives. Zara, on the other hand, the youngest one, speaks the truth like Cordelia. However, instead of Cordelia's mere "nothing, my lord," Harsha makes Zara respond poetically in the following words. And this is what Zara responds. She says, अब्बा जान, मैं क्या अर्ज करूं, इताअत मुझसे कहती है कि तू चुप रह नहीं सकती, मगर मेरा ये कहना है कि मैं कुछ कह नहीं सकती. Her reply is followed by a song, Gar Gaur Gar Hai Dana, philosophizing the need to think wisely before iterating. A debate then ensues between Hakan and Zara, establishing her Cordelia like character quite firmly in the play. Songs, like comic scenes, were integral to Parsi theatre and helped in making Parsi theatre a successful industry. Believe me, I have a paper that I've written and it's been published in a book called Bollywood Shakespeare's, where my contention is that Parsi theatre was actually the forerunner to Bollywood, the early Hindi cinema. Uh, but anyways, Ranveer Singh, who's a theatre historian, in his History of Parsi Theatre, writes that it was important for actors to have knowledge of singing, since there was no provision for background singing. Since songs also played the role of dialogues at many places in a play, it was important that the songs were set to such tunes that the audience could easily understand its words and could sing along. Somnath Gupta, another scholar, theatre scholar, notes that even fighting heroes and dying heroines would sing on the Urdu stage, and that the addiction to songs grew to such an extent that occasions of joy, deaths, wars, and dialogues were all accompanied by singing. While Parsi theatre used classical Indian music beside ghazals, one could also find pieces of Western music. It is interesting to note that Harsha had also acquainted himself with a few Hindustani ragas at the behest of a poet friend so as to succeed in playwriting. Sufad Khan also features a number of songs, at least 22. And I mean, 22 is nothing in Parsi theatre, it could go up to 50. Some are sung by the chorus, while others by the dramatis personae in the play. In fact, almost everyone in the play sings, ranging from a geet to ghazal to a thumri. Here is a ghazal sung by Ursulan, who's Kent, in Act 1, Scene 2. And he starts on a very philosophical note, and then, after an introduction and then a geet, he breaks into a ghazal, which is ताजुब ठोकरों में क्यों सरे फगफूर होता है गुरूर ज़ौर ज़र इस घर से यूं ही दूर होता है जवानी में दम के वास्ते सामान कर गाफिल मुसाफिर शब से उठते हैं जो जाना दूर होता है हमारी जिंदगी हश्र मिट्टी का खिलौना है अजल की एक ठोकर से जो चकनाचूर होता है. Another important aspect of Shakespeare adaptation in Parsi theatre was transforming the tragedies into happy endings. And this might have been the influence of classical and traditional theatres of India, which have not entertained a tragedy as a dramatic genre except in Bhas. Uh, Hashratu ends Sufed Khun happily with Zara and Khakan, that's Cordelia and Lear, uniting and the king iterating the unfilial deeds of uh, his daughters Mahbara, Jahara, and Edmund, of course. And this is how he, towards the end, Khagan says, Zohak na Firaun na Shaddad ne kiya, जो तुझ पर और मुझ पर मेरी औलाद ने किया सीने में हो गया है दिले ना उम्मीद खून देखा तो क्या सुना भी नहीं ऐसा सफेद खून. And this is reiterating the theme of the play, देखा तो क्या सुना भी नहीं ऐसा सफेद खून. The play finally ends with Khakan blessing Zara and her husband, and the entire court joining the nuptial celebrations by singing and dancing. Now, such an eclectic, you know, Shakespeare was the hallmark of Parsi Urdu theatre. The Parsi theatre and Aga Harsha Kashmiri took a good deal from Shakespeare, but they did it on their own terms. Unlike the Indian classroom during the colonial times, sometimes even in the post-colonial classrooms, that played into the hands of colonial discourse, which had already established Shakespeare as the paragon of Western civilization, Parsi theatre freely adapted Shakespeare to suit its purposes. Let me let me conclude my talk in a typical Parsi theatre style by quoting a share of Aga Harsha Kashmiri, who usually, like a shayer or like a poet writing a ghazal, would introduce his takhallus or pen name in the last share of his dramas, following the ghazal tradition. So even Sufed Khun ends on a share. Ehle zami pe surate mehre falak raho, जिंदा रहो निहाल रहो हर्षद रहो. Shukriya. Thank you.